What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 18 in season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. This episode is part 4 of the series where my guests share their views in response to the question, if you could change one thing about our system of democracy, what would it be? And it is also the last episode in season 2. I'll be taking a break now to put together season 3, which will be looking at elections, voting and alternatives. So first up, let's hear from Professor Nadia Urbinati in response to the question. Nadia is a professor of political theory and Hellenic studies at Columbia University. She's a political theorist who specialises in modern and contemporary political thought and the democratic and anti-democratic traditions. I previously spoke with Nadia about the development of representative democracy in episode 2 of season 2.
Well, yeah, it's very complicated. Perhaps I don't know how to do it because I'm not an expert in institutions making, but I would like to find a way of making political parties, more controllable by us, and not to make the situation so rotten that the magistrates must intervene. Generally, we have corruption, but when corruption arrives, it's too late. So we should anticipate the intervention of the magistrates by regulations, by procedures, by some legal intervention that allows us to better control the life of the party, the life of our representatives, the way in which money from private corporations enter into the public. And this should be defined, in my view, a gate that limits, that blocks this flux of money from private to public. That, yes, and to strengthen the parliamentary system more and more, in some sense.
Next up is Dr Simon Longstaff. Simon is the Executive Director of the Ethics Centre here in Sydney and was my guest in episode 17 of season 2, talking about the relationship between democracy and ethics.
If I could make one change, I would increase the capacity throughout the whole of every deliberative body for our elected representatives always to act according to good conscience. To the extent that the whip is applied to people within political parties, in some parties it's applied with an absolute discipline, in others there's a greater degree of freedom. But I would make every vote, if you like, a conscience vote. The idea that anybody votes in Parliament in a way that is odd with their conscience, I think, very unfortunate.
Now we'll hear from Lewis Adams, who was a juror on the Infrastructure Victoria Citizens Jury in 2015 and a guest on episode 17 in season 1, where I spoke with a number of citizens jurors.
That's a tough one. I guess moving away from personality politics, one big thing is with the current system that Australia and a number of Western countries have in place right now, politics tends to be based more on personality and digs at the opponent. Yeah, I think it's very, very much based on ego and personality, digs at the opposition, and the sort of the 3-year or the 4-year election cycle, when really we really need to be thinking longer than the next election term. We need to be thinking decades into the future, even in certain cases where it's appropriate, centuries.
Nancy Thomas is the Director at the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education in the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts College. My interview with Nancy will be published in a later season of the podcast.
Oh, boy. I only get one thing now. We've got a lot that needs to be done. I feel like the structures for selecting our elected officials are broken to the point of they need intensive care. But I think that in the end, if I could change one thing, it really would be education at all levels, K-12 and higher education and graduate school. I think higher education needs to embed across the curriculum civic and political learning. I think it needs to be thorough, and I think it needs to be mandatory. And as I said earlier, I think it needs to be well done. I'm very concerned not only by the lack of civic education, but by the lack of equality, equal access to civic education. We know from research that our students who live in affluent communities have more access to civic education than those in poor communities. Well, that then you can imagine how that would just carry through to the very structures of democracy in this country. So equal access to high quality and thorough and mandatory civic education.
Next we hear from Helene Landemore, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale University. Helene's research interests encompass democratic theory, theories of justice, Enlightenment thinkers, and the philosophy of social sciences. I spoke with Helene in episode 2 of season 1 about why deliberative mini-publics work.
So I don't want to change only one thing. So that's why I'm writing this new book about the necessity of a shift of paradigm from our current representative government, which is only semi-democratic, to post-representative democracy, where a lot of those democratic innovations we're talking about, including mini-publics, would be implemented and would truly change the nature of the relation between citizens and the representatives. But if you press me, I would say that currently the most important thing to do is probably to take money out of politics. I think it definitely enslaves representatives to their donors, and it makes Rousseau's quip that being represented is being enslaved too true in a way. So I think European democracies where money does not play such a role are a bit healthier than the American one at the moment. But they all have their issues. So I think taking money out of politics is a good beginning, but it's only a way to take care of one problem, and there are many more.
Assistant Professor JeanPaul Ganyan from the University of Canberra is a philosopher of democracy specialising in democratic theory. I spoke with JeanPaul in episode 6 in season 2 about his work identifying the many adjectives associated with democracy.
I'll be a little bit cheeky here, so my answer is a question. Which system are you referring to?
So I think I'm going to say to you, as you and I both live in Australia, let's go with the current system of democracy here in Australia.
I would want to see 2 changes, I think. At least. The first is to make electoral systems fairer, so that a party or person who receives, let's say, less than 40% of the vote cannot form a majority government or, let's say, become president, for instance. And I'd also like to see an improvement to referendum procedures so that they foster more dialogue. And yeah, okay, they'll take longer because of that, presumably. But I'd like to see them lead to some better, perhaps a supermajority decision, and not these type of cockamamie, split decisions where 49% doesn't want one direction and 51% does. I mean, these are artificial distinctions as well, because you're not getting 51% of the total population, or oftentimes even the total number of registered voters. So the second change I'd like to see is that political parties, parliaments, and other institutions of the state use many more democratic innovations. So deliberative democracy, electronic democracy, participatory, agonistic, and so on democracies have plenty to offer for the policy cycle, and they can be of instrumental value in the development of better, more comprehensive and resilient policies that are designed to benefit the public interest.
Next we hear from Harm van Dyck, who was one of the founders of the G1000 in the Netherlands. I spoke with Harm in episode 15 in season 1 about the design of the G1000 there.
Put the citizen on top again and get rid of all these systemic things which you don't understand why something is happening, but it is happening and you can't have any influence on it as a citizen. We should end this. We should end all this dealing and wheeling and working of politicians together to find solutions out of sight of the citizens. We have to bring this into the open. And talking about this, I come at the most important objective of change. This is that we stop laying all our attention to the differences, which is what politicians do, because they survive thanks to the differences and to exploiting differences. We should lay our attention to what connects us, what makes a community, what we have in common. And this is basically what we try to do with the new form of the G1000. The Dutch G1000 emphasizes everything we have in common and makes it explicit. And this is why people are so lucky. If you see our movies we have at our site, you see very, very enthusiastic people. And why are they so enthusiastic? Because they feel really connected to each other again. And this is a feeling we are losing in the Western world, because we are so busy with fulfilling our individual requirements. What we do with the G1000 is creating common ground again. So giving people the possibility to get to know each other, to hear about the views of the other, to hear about why he or she thinks on a different level or a different point of view. And it is so nice to get to know the people you are afraid of, because then you feel connected again. When you are in the room, that is why we are not very enthusiastic about all these digital ways of new democracy. We think basically you should get to know each other again and connect to each other again. And from there on, we can feel that we are connected, that we are part and member of a community. And when we feel that, we are motivated to work for this community and to work for the greater good and to think a little bit less important about our own interests. So this is what happens all the time when we have people in the room. When I have people in the room, they come in to defend their own interests, and during the process they change over from their own interests to the community interests. And this is a fascinating process to see, and it happens all the time, and it happens with everyone in the room. And this is what we need. We need a change from all this attention to the differences, where the politicians live from, where the media live from, and we have to change our attention to all the things we agree upon, because this really makes a safer world, when we live in a world where we can feel that we are connected, that we work together, and where we come forward.
The next person to answer the question, if you could change one thing about democracy, what would it be, is Professor James Fishkin, who holds the Janet M. Peck Chair in International Communication at Stanford University, where he is a Professor of Communication, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Centre for Deliberative Democracy. I spoke with Professor Fishkin about deliberative polling in episode 16 in season 1.
I can't answer that. It's not one thing. There's so many. It's such a complex challenge.
Your top 2 priorities, maybe?
Well, I'd figure out some way of getting rid of fake news and creating a taste and capacity for evidence-based, thoughtful discussion with mutual respect between those who might otherwise disagree. So we need to reform our broken public dialogue and create a thoughtful public sphere. And in the case of mini publics, we can do it on selected issues, but they have to be placed in a broader deliberative system where people actually listen to each other and not just to the like-minded.
Next is Andy Holdup, who was a member of the Citizens Assembly South in Southampton in the UK in 2015, and also a guest on episode 17 in season 1.
I think it would be, I don't think there's a switch that you can change that will change the nature of democracy, but the one aspect that I would like to see change in is levels of trust between people. I think we've got to find a way of breaking down the mistrust that people have for democratic institutions, because the alternatives are very unpleasant. And we've got to break down the mistrust that people have for the electorate as well. So we've got to find ways. The thing that strikes me every time these days I talk about politics with people is just how little we're listening to people with different opinions, for whatever reason that might be. So we're very quick to dismiss people. We're very quick to say, if you have that opinion, your motivation is this, and I'm not going to listen to you. You're a politician, therefore you're always in it for yourself, and you're going to be lying. There are barriers of mistrust that mean we simply don't listen to each other very much, and it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve anything democratic without changing that. I was quite interested, again, listening to things in earlier podcasts when you were talking about people's reaction to hearing that exercises like this were being used. The idea of, well, we've elected someone to do the job, why don't we let them do it? And I was thinking, well, actually, one of the things that I suspect is behind that is, who are those people you've selected to do this? They're not me. And I have a feeling that actually being part of one of these processes will start to mark people out already as being different from the general population, because we're very, very quick to mistrust anyone who seems to have some kind of in.
And finally, we hear from Benjamin Issachar, who is an Associate Professor of Politics and Policy Studies and Founding Director of Polis, a research network for politics and international relations in the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. I spoke with Ben in episode 4 of season 2 about non-Western democracy.
Well, I'm tempted to say that I would change the electoral college system in the US given recent events in the last few months. I think democracy faces a host of different challenges and it's under threat from all different quarters. Certainly not even reading the newspapers these days, not even hard to identify who the enemies of democracy are. In fact, many of them have taken centre stage and are quite proudly anti-democratic in a broad sense of what that might mean. We certainly have a lot of issues. Fake news, of course, is a very popular one at the moment. It's the rise of the right across Europe. Populism and demagoguery is huge. There's a real denigration of leadership, I feel, that people are able to invent a meme that may not even be true and circulate it through their networks, potentially to hundreds of thousands of people within minutes, denigrating Malcolm Turnbull over something he hasn't even said. That you can just make something up. He's decided to cut all schools, and ruin our children's future. And you can make a little meme and put that up on your Facebook. Hundreds of thousands of people will read it. They will increase their cynicism and objection to the Turnbull government, and it'll create it. And therefore we'll have a terrible poll the next day, and therefore the Liberal Party wants to change their leader, and we'll have our, 6th Prime Minister in however many years. And I think that that's a real problem. I don't really know how to answer this question. I guess fundamentally, people are the cornerstone of any democracy, and the more participation and the more people that get involved in it, the better off we all are. But I don't really know what that one thing that I could change or that I would like to see changed about our current system of democracy. I really don't know the answer to that. It's a very difficult question.
Thank you for joining me for Season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast, looking at how representative democracy developed and how it operates. I'll be back with Season 3 on elections, voting and alternatives in September 2017. If you haven't yet subscribed to the podcast, I'd suggest you do that now so that when Season 3 starts, you'll automatically have those episodes downloaded onto your podcast app. I look forward to you joining me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now. You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.